Hello. I want to have a casual chat about everything that I read. 9 books in total. Most of them were quite positive experiences, although one I found to be increasingly disappointing as the novel went on. And another book in this group, I think I've decided not to finish it. I keep trying to go back to it and getting frustrated again. And so I just move on from it again. So I'm going to talk about all of these books, but I would love to hear what you have read over the past several weeks and whether it was a positive experience or not. Now, the very first book I want to discuss I absolutely loved. It is The Delusions by Jenni Fagan, who's a very accomplished Scottish novelist. And this story follows a woman named Eddie who works in the afterlife, helping to process the recently dead. She works in this kind of admin position, and they find that the queues going through this grow increasingly long, and it's her duty to sort of confront these individuals about what they did in their lives, because she knows everything, all of their dirty little secrets, and it is her job to make these individuals own up to what they have done and extract from themselves their own self-delusion about who they really are. And this is a painful process. I mean, it's described how the extracting someone's delusion is kind of like pulling out a thorny vine, from their insides. And this may seem like a kind of fanciful construct in a story of a kind of morality tale, but I found this to be so poignant and meaningful, especially because I read Jenni Fagan's memoir last year called Ootlin, which describes her experiences growing up in the care system. It's a really harrowing memoir about the challenges and horrors that she faced growing up, being caught in this system of admin, of being shuffled from place to place, where everything about her existence was kind of reduced down to pieces of paper. And because of that, I felt, and knowing that about her background, I felt that this story was so much more poignant and powerful because of that. And if you've not read her memoir, which I would really advise you to do, I don't know how that would change a reader's experience of this story, but for me personally, I just found that aspect of it so powerful. And Eddie has been working in this position for 47 years and has been desperately searching and hoping that her son will eventually come through this queue, because when she died, her son was quite young, and she really wants to re-encounter him. And she died in quite a horrible way due to mismanagement of in the medical position. She had cancer, and she went through an experimental treatment, and her doctor basically treated her like an experimental subject. And so there's a real frustration and anger with the malpractice in the medical profession in this novel. And in that way, it kind of reminded me a bit, actually, of another memoir as well, of Constellations by Sinead Gleason, which is another really brilliant memoir that when it came out several years ago, it was one of my favorite books that I read. It's about an Irish woman who is really struggling with medical issues and really frustrated with the limitations of the medical profession that she encounters, the callousness of some unscrupulous doctors, but also it describes the cosmos in a really beautiful way in that memoir, as is done in this novel as well. And I loved the descriptions in this of the afterlife. There are just some absolutely gorgeous descriptions of the universe and the movement of the cosmos. And there's a real playfulness in how she describes that, but also a real beauty to it as well. And there's a real playfulness in the way that Jenni Fagan, handles the afterlife in this way, because animals pass through the afterlife as well. And at one point, a whole huge load of cats just like pass through in the afterlife, which is why there's an outline of a cat on the cover of this novel, as well as a depiction of constellations in this and the universe. And I was so inspired by the descriptions of the universe in this story that I actually went in London to the Science Museum, because there's a new virtual reality exhibit on called Starstruck, where you're literally led through the cosmos. And I enjoyed that, although I think my VR thing was on too tight, and so when I came out, my head just had this huge red mark on it for ages. It was really beautiful, although virtual reality doesn't quite, I never really entirely believed I was there, but it was really cool, sort of being able to see these things up close, and sort of stand on the edge of a black hole and be able to look down on a planet that is completely volcanic, and things like that. It was a fun experience, but I'm so geeky about outer space stuff, and I love watching science nature programs about outer space and stuff. And so I loved the descriptions of that in the novel, and it really brought the story alive for me. There were some sections in it where it felt like it was dragging a little bit, because Eddie is often complaining about her job, and even though she has this extraordinary profession in the afterlife, after a while it did just start to feel like anyone complaining about their tedious job. Although, obviously there's extraordinary circumstances in this, and it leads up to quite a dramatic ending. I mean, things are really changing on the planet, and that is affecting their work in the afterlife. But also, Eddie is part of this system that she doesn't understand where these people are going to after she processes them, not entirely. So it's almost like the cosmos or whatever system is holding people in this way. It's like a kind of big faceless government system that is controlling every aspect of their lives, and they have no sort of say in it. So there's no sort of comfort in the afterlife. There's just more admin. And there's a line in this novel that struck me so much, where she says towards the end, "We have so much more to give and receive than the structures of humanity even vaguely allow." And isn't that the truth? For me, this was a really excellent experience, and I thought a really beautiful, poignant, and powerful novel. And it was really interesting to compare as well to George Saunders' most recent novel, Vigil, which also deals with someone who is kind of helping people, the recently dead, in their journey in the afterlife, and getting them to confront what they really did. But personally, I felt like the Delusions kind of handled it in a more dynamic and creative way, although each of the novels, I think, have their own strengths. But I really loved reading this. Another excellent novel that I just finished reading is Beginning, Middle, End by Valeria Luiselli. And this story follows a mother and daughter in Sicily, who the mother has just published a book recently, and she's kind of gone on a book tour around Europe, but she has also recently divorced. And she and her daughter are in Sicily kind of trying to figure out what happens next. The mother is working on a new book, but she doesn't really know entirely what shape it's going to take. and they are sort of staying in an apartment of a man who's her new lover, though he is out touring because he's a musician, and she and her daughter are just staying there in this apartment in Sicily, reading from classical literature, but also they have this special mosaic which the mother's grandmother had found in an archaeological dig and kept for herself. And this mosaic is of a Greek god who is able to tell the future and the past. And this story is all about trying to figure out our position in life in relation to where we are in the present, where we have been, where we are going. It's this really big question of where we are situated in time and the experience of being in the middle of your life and figuring out, well, can I have a new beginning, or am I caught up in this path towards the end of life? And this is all wrapped in to her writing and the structure of writing. And I know it can seem kind of cliched, a novel that's about the process of writing, but how Valeria Luiselli handles this in this book, I think is really poignant and powerful, of considering kind of narrative structures. There's a part where she's considering Aristotle and kind of his rules of plot, that, there's a beginning and middle and end, and she is looking at this kind of reassessment of what the middle really means and how she wants to progress forward. And it's looking at generations of women, so the mother's grandmother, but also her mother, who is back in North America and who may be going through the early stages of dementia. And so it's looking at these generations and what is remembered and what is passed along, and is the authenticity of what is being passed on, is that what really matters, or is it the feeling that is conveyed by the person who is passing it on? Is that the really important aspects of the generations? And I really liked how the mother and daughter relationship in this was handled, and also that they remain nameless, so it kind of feels like a continuum, that the mother's mother, she was the mother at one point and the mother was the daughter, but now she is the mother, and her daughter, might become a mother one day too. So looking at this kind of heritage and this movement forward, I would say this is much more a contemplative novel than one that is especially about plot. Although, interestingly, right in the middle of the book, there is quite a gripping moment when the mother has to make a very dramatic decision about what she's going to do because of their circumstances. And also lingering in the background is a volcano which is kind of simmering, and there is news of like wildfires caused by this volcano and volcanic activity. And so there's this increasing sense of pressure throughout the story about what is she going to do. And I hadn't realized it when I first began this novel, but it is quite clearly a continuum of Valeria Luiselli's previous novel of Lost Children Archive, which is a road trip story that follows a woman and a man and their respective children as they are traveling around the country, but also experiencing real difficulties in their relationship. And we see in this story the culmination of that as the mother has left that man and taken with her her own biological daughter, where the biological son of the man stayed with him. And interestingly, Valeria Luiselli said in a short interview that she doesn't think of this as a sequel, though this clearly is a continuation of those same characters and that story, but it's not really a continuation so much in plot-wise, because it is more about this mother and daughter's present moment and what they are going through and the issues that they're grappling with. And it's a kind of different story, although it does refer back to some things in Lost Children archive, like how she wrote in that story that the daughter has a harrowing moment where she almost drowns. And the daughter in this, she refers back to that as reading that, though it's something that didn't actually happen to her, but because she's read it, it's created this kind of false memory for her. So Valeria Luiselli is looking at these, issues to do with truth and what becomes the truth. And when we read stories and myths, how they take on this presence in our minds and the meaning and impact of that. What are the ramifications of that? And I really enjoyed how it looks at the complex nature of storytelling, and I found it a really poignant read. Now, there is quite a big shift towards the end of the book, and I've heard from some other readers already who really didn't like that change. I thought it was kind of interesting how it works into the story, how this book becomes almost a collaborative experience between the mother and daughter, and especially because, like in Lost Children Archive, there's included a number of different visual images, that it's not all just text, that there are some Polaroids that are kind of following their journey. I mean, I think maybe ultimately it would have been better if the mother had just continued writing this story, but I understand the larger meaning that Valeria Luiselli was trying to create with this kind of shift in the story. So yeah, if you've read this, I'd be really interested to hear if that worked for you or didn't work for you, or if it makes you intrigued to read this story now if you've not read it yet. But yeah, I thought this was a really impactful and beautiful story. I also wanted to note a line in this novel that I found really powerful in how it contemplates our situation and where we're going next. She writes, "I'm afraid of not knowing where to begin and how to end. Beginnings and endings are confusing. They are written as if in a foreign alphabet." I also read another excellent novel that coincidentally is also very much about mother and daughter relationships, but in a very different context, and that is Boudicca's Daughter by Elodie Harper. And Boudicca is a very famous figure from British history, a kind of warrior queen that led an uprising against the Romans who controlled the British Isles way back in 1661 AD. Boudicca led this uprising against those Roman forces, and I think because she's probably taught a lot in British schools, but I grew up in an American educational system, so I just personally never heard of her before. And I was inspired at the very beginning of this book. Elodie Harper describes how there's actually a statue dedicated to Boudicca herself right next to Big Ben in London, and so I was inspired to go look at that statue myself, because I'd probably passed by it before but never really noticed it. And she notes how it's very interesting, the positioning of that statue, because Boudicca is on a chariot as if about to attack, and both of her daughters are behind her on this chariot, and the statue is facing the Houses of Parliament as if she is about to invade the structure of the British government. So the way that this novel looks at sort of power structures and nationalism, and what does it mean to try to safeguard one's nation? Is it about just protecting one's home and one's family and one's community, or does it become about one's own quest for power and revenge? And that is the complication that Boudicca experiences as her own nation is controlled oppressively by Rome, who just kind of pillage and take what they want from the country. And so for Boudicca, she decides no more. I'm not going to take this anymore. And so leads this uprising, and we follow the consequences of that through one of her daughters throughout this period of strife. And we follow this daughter and her very difficult position as she lives in the aftermath of this failed uprising, but also travels to Rome and the palaces of Nero, and we follow her story. Virtually nothing is known about Boudicca's daughters. So Elodie Harper kind of fictionally reimagines what her situation might have been like. And she has a very complicated relationship with her mother Boudicca, and so a lot of the story is about that, but also about her trying to achieve a sense of independence. It's partly a romance because she falls for a man who is a Roman, so obviously there are big conflicts about that, and she feels a lot of conflicted feelings about that herself, about whether she is just kind of scheming and this is part of the relationship, or does she genuinely feel this love and passion for him. And so I found I didn't find the romance side of the story as engaging as the larger historical context, and the way that Elodie Harper creates this really evocative and highly detailed story about this period of time, and how violent and difficult and horrible this period of time was in many ways, but it brought it to life in a really evocative way. It's the very first novel I've read by Elodie Harper, and I'd really like to explore some more of her historical fiction. Whistler by Anne Patchett is a novel that I read with my online book club, and so we've had lots of discussions about this, and it's been so fascinating talking about this novel, because I thought the story would be fairly benign and most people would just find it an enjoyable experience. But no, this novel divided readers in our groups really strongly, and that kind of mirrors the critical response to this book, where most critics have been fairly positive about this novel, but others have been quite cutting about it, and I just found that really fascinating. And so the story follows a woman named Daphne, who is she's a teacher. She's in her 50s, and she is wandering around the Met Museum in New York one day with her husband when she comes across a man who was her former stepfather, and who she had a really crucial experience in her adolescence with, a very dramatic experience with him that kind of ties her to him, but she hasn't seen him in many years, and so they have this instant reconnection with each other and have this special bond with each other because of this shared past that they went through. And through their exchanges, Daphne kind of better understands her own childhood and what she went through, and has conversations with her family about her early years and this dramatic incident that she experienced with her stepfather Eddie. But also they have this shared love of literature, because Daphne is a teacher and Eddie is an editor at a publisher. And so there's lots of geeky literary talk about books in this novel, which I know is somewhat self-indulgent, but I really enjoy. And there's one great scene where Daphne's at a party with Eddie, and Eddie introduces her to a woman who says she has read everything, and so likes to challenge people to suggest to her a book that she hasn't read. And so Daphne goes through this series of books trying to find something that this woman hasn't read and isn't successful in it. And so yeah, I found that aspect of the novel really enjoyable, and the overall tone of this book just has this kind of quiet, contemplative nature to it. Nothing too dramatic happens or horrible happens in the story. That most of the characters are essentially quite good people. I mean, some of them are quite annoying and distasteful, but I think they're kind of at heart mostly quite good people. The mother's quite complicated in her in the way that she does mother, but also that Daphne and her sister really recognize that her mother had a really difficult time. She went through 3 different marriages. She raised 4 children, and yeah, so really admire what their mother has done, but are also quite critical of her, which is an experience that I think a lot of people have with their parents, this kind of complicated relationship, and how she depicts that I found to be very realistic and moving, whereas some other readers have criticized this book that who find these characters quite irritating, that the story is quite dull, that they find the prose quite flat. But yeah, personally, it all really worked for me, and I enjoyed it. And I like how there's this plot point in the story of the dramatic thing that Daphne and Eddie went through early on in their lives, that we don't fully know everything that happened around this, and how they survived this situation until much later in the book. And so that's a kind of point of narrative tension that carried me through the story, as well as this kind of gentle examination of family relationships and our relationship to our memory and our own past, and how, in our adulthood, sometimes we can realize certain things when we suddenly think back on our childhood or adolescence and something that we just accepted at the time, and we suddenly realize, oh, that was actually quite a strange situation. And of course, you just accept it as a child because you don't really know any better or don't understand the larger complications of a certain situation. But then, yeah, as an adult, you just think back on that and you think, oh, that must have been what was really going on then. And one aspect of this novel is Eddie's own homosexuality, and how he has had a long-term relationship with another man, but it is quite a complicated situation. And I quite like how the novel presented that, because there are so many aspects of Eddie's story and his relationship that I think a lot of people just looking at it from the outside would judge. But then Eddie going through this, and through the periods of time that he went through as a gay man, that difficult choices had to be made. And who are we to judge how people have been able to manage their relationship within the larger social context? And so yeah, I thought that was a really great aspect of the novel. There's a kind of overall story of something that Eddie tells Daphne when they're in this early dramatic situation, a story of a woman in peril, kind of meeting figures who have died, that have been very meaningful to her. And I liked how that story interacted with the overall themes of the novel, although this as a story that Eddie really wanted to publish. I kind of questioned whether this would be a kind of memoir that he would actually want to publish, because it just kind of comes across as, I don't know, kind of sentimental, and yeah, I didn't really believe that aspect of it, though. Yeah, I liked how the themes of that worked with the larger story. So yeah, for this novel, it was really successful for me, but also really interesting to hear from other readers who did not like it and who had real big issues with it. So if you've read this and had your own reactions to it, I'd love to hear about those. Stations by Louise Kennedy is a novel that I was lucky enough to read an early advance copy of this. This isn't going to be published in the UK until September. And her previous novel, Trespasses, was so excellent. And so I was really excited to read this story, which follows a teenage girl named Roisin, who in the early 80s in Ireland, she meets a man named Red, another teenage boy named Red. And they form this connection with each other. She is very attracted to him. They have some vaguely romantic interactions, but it's more about an ongoing friendship over a long period of time. In that way, it superficially reminds me of Normal People by Sally Rooney, although the way that this is written and the way that the story progresses, I think is quite different. And I like how she evoked these teenagers' early years of all of the infighting between different teenagers, the levels of kind of social relationships and social structures within this context. And it follows them as they both eventually move to London and are squatting in this house in London with a number of other people and just trying to kind of figure out where they're going in their lives. And there's moodiness to the story that I really enjoyed and connected with at first. But I found as the story went on, I got increasingly frustrated with it because it felt like it's from Roisin's point of view, and her motivations and her drive in her story all become subsumed to this kind of almost obsession with Red and wanting to reconnect with him, even though they kind of drift apart. And at one point she re-encounters him and almost like doesn't even acknowledge him. But then at a later point, she just feels, oh, I need to find Red. And so like goes on almost this quest to track him down. And then everything about her character just becomes subsumed to him and a concern for him, which I think says something much larger about her and her own character and story. But yeah, it just frustrated me that it felt like, well, but what is going on in her own life, and what is what is her motivation other than just following after this man? And yeah, certainly our lives can become completely subsumed to this like passionate love, which is often about much larger things to do with our own past and our connection to our own personal history. But I really liked this novel to begin with, but then found it increasingly disappointed. So I'll be really keen to hear from other readers when eventually many more readers experience this, how they find this story and what the critical response to this book is, because I came into it with a lot of high expectations and really enjoyed it at first, and I really enjoyed how it follows the energy of these periods, and there's some really dramatic scenes in this story. I mean, how it handles, there's an incident of sexual assault in this story, and that is not depicted explicitly, but the after effects of that, I mean, how she depicts that, I found it even more powerful, kind of the absences in this story and how she leaves out some crucial incidents which then feel like the reverberations of that feel all the more powerful because of the absence of the immediate action. So yeah, there are some aspects of the book that I found really striking, but overall I was quite disappointed in the story. The next few books I'm going to talk about quite briefly because I've made separate videos about them, so I'll put links to them below if you want to know more of my thoughts about these. But Country People by Daniel Mason was just a joy and pleasure to read, of following a man who's a PhD student, but also a husband and father. And he follows his wife as she moves to a small town in Vermont because she gets a teaching position there. So he moves, they go on this kind of cross-country trip at the very beginning. And at the very beginning of the book, the names of these characters aren't given. They're just referred to as the positions that they have in their family, and only later are they given names. And I think Daniel Mason is leading the reader into this story in this way, where they almost have this kind of anonymity before they become specific in their arrival point in Vermont. And I know some readers have had a real issue with this, but personally I've enjoyed the way that this kind of eases the reader into the story. And there's such a comic edge to the way that Daniel Mason writes this story that is kind of partly poking fun at this man, but also taking him seriously, but also poking fun at the colorful individuals that this family meet in Vermont, in this small town, and how they have their own systems of belief and superstitions, which they are holding on to, and how this is a gradual exploration of these larger superstitions that are going on in this community, and how this father and husband and PhD student, he kind of goes on this investigation of it, believing that it's kind of research for his PhD about Russian folklore and looking at larger systems of folklore, but really I think he's just kind of avoiding committing in his life and committing to profession. And it explores his real insecurity about this. And at one point he takes a kind of quiz about like, oh, what profession should you go into? And the quiz comes back with the response, maybe you want to rethink your answers to these questions. And so yeah, there's so many sort of kind of comic observations in the story like that. There's another part where he is kind of reveling in being in nature and just enjoying the countryside, and so he goes out topless, and he describes how I was as topless as Adam, a little softer but better read, and so this kind of his kind of insecurities about his own body, and but he takes pride in the fact that he's very well read, and so yeah, there are so many lines in this novel that just made me kind of chuckle and laugh along, and I just found the story as a whole to be such a pleasure, and also the family's relationship with their dog, and all of the really interesting characters that they encounter along the way, but also as this kind of examination of tensions in a long-term relationship, and how it looks at that in a way that is also complicated and meaningful alongside this larger comic story. Now, I was so convinced that Having Spent Life Seeking by Kai Tempest was going to just win this year's Booker Prize. So I was so surprised when it wasn't even listed for the Booker, because I found this story to be so powerful, and I really connected it. It's the story of Rothko, who's been recently released from prison, and how they are really struggling to reintegrate into larger society. They've been in prison for a very long time, but also encountering figures from their personal history. And it's this kind of reckoning with family relationships and struggles with addiction, but also issues to do with gender and gender identity, and how that impacts Rothko's life so much. The way that Rothko is perceived and judgments that are made upon Rothko, that I found it really emotional and so relevant to what we are going through in society right now, that so-called political debates are having real impact on individuals' lives in terms of their safety, in terms of their own sense of who they are, and the way that the story deals with this in such a humane way of getting back to the real humanity of individuals' lives and how they are lived, and how the perceptions of other people, and just making that human connection. And this is written in such a poetic and beautiful way as well, that even though the story is quite solemn and dealing with a lot of serious subject matter, there's also just a lightness and beauty to this story that I so admired and loved. And Honey in the Wound by JiYoung Han is a really excellent multi-generational historical story that follows a family basically through almost an entire century, beginning in the early 1900s in Korea, and through a period of Japanese colonialism in the country, and how it affects this family over a long period of time. And there are many harrowing incidents in this story, but also there is liveliness and real dynamic aspect to this story that just made me so engrossed in the lives of these characters, and following them through the years, through these periods of history, which I do have some knowledge of, but I felt like this really brought home the reality of what certain individuals were going through this period of colonialism, and the larger effects that it had upon communities and country. And so I thought this novel was so excellently done, really powerful and extremely creative. And finally, there is the novel Dooneen by Keith Ridgway, which is the book that I've really struggled to finish, that I've got fairly far into it, like over 200 pages. So I don't have all that much more to go, but every time I go back to this book, I get really frustrated because I feel like I don't really entirely know what is going on, which is part of the point of the story, but also that, I just feel kind of completely lost. So I would characterize this book as kind of Mrs. Dalloway as if it were written by Samuel Beckett, because we follow a man in this story who the story begins in London when he is with his lover Muti, and part of this story is a really tender and loving gay relationship, and the entire story is the narrator writing to his lover and wanting to be back with him. But then at the beginning of the story, he is transported to Dublin. And how he is transported is he just kind of walks into a bush in a park in South London. And coincidentally, as I started reading this book, I was in a bus in London, and we passed by that very park, which is mentioned in this story. And so it was kind of one of those weird coincidences of reading a book and having that kind of connection. So he's kind of transported to Dublin, where reality is slightly off from what it really is. And he is there supposedly for a conference, but then he gets drawn into this larger kind of rebellion movement, and this movement which is trying to break down economic differences and economic levels in society. And so he kind of joins this almost revolutionary group, but yeah, I struggle to get a grasp on a lot of the characters that he's following and what is actually happening in the story. And there's this kind of odd sort of sense throughout it that, well, is he even living? Maybe he's dead. There's all of these kind of tensions going on. Is he really faithfully depicting what is going on, or is this just kind of a hazy memory of his? And he notes at one point that my memory is such that rubbled with books and fevers, I'm utterly confused. So here we are, and that kind of reflects, I think, really well both the way that this is written, in these kind of bits of sentences that kind of make up the narrative, but also that there is this kind of haziness to his perception of things, which creates a certain mood, but also a real confusion, which personally I just was struggling with while I was continuing to read this book. So there are moments in this story that I really enjoyed, but as it was going on, it was just getting a bit too loose and frustrating for me to want to continue with it. So I think I am going to ultimately put it down and not finish it. Though I think Keith Ridgway is such an interesting writer. His previous book, A Shock, is so excellent. I absolutely loved that book, although that book is also very, very strange and odd. But yeah, so I really admire in a way what he's doing as a writer, but personally, I'm just finding it a bit of a slog to get through. So decided not to finish this book. So that is everything that I read in the month of July. I would love to hear if you have read any of these books, what you think about them, or if you read anything else recently that you really want to let me know about. But yeah, we've had the excitement of the Booker Prize long list announcement. I'm really looking forward to reading more from that long list, and I hope you're doing well and reading good things. I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.